consortium virtual workshop with, we have Konstantin Ash's paper on the queue today, and Joe Wright is going to get us started. Turn the floor to you, Joe.
Great, thanks, Will. So let me start by saying that overall, I really enjoyed reading the paper. I buy the story that it's about domestic politics. That should be unsurprising. And I really like the first two hypotheses. I'm going to organize my comments under three subsections. The first is just a couple questions I have about the explanations that are in the literature, and these aren't necessarily intended for this paper, but just sort of the larger literature that this is situating itself in. The second is talk a little bit about some of the arguments, and then the third is the data and some of the research design stuff. So first, real quickly, the two big alternative explanations that I see offered in the paper and in the literature, I just have a real big question as to why can't donors look at pro-government militias? Why can't they find evidence of that? I think that's what they do, in fact. Lots of groups collect evidence about the repression that pro-government militias conduct. So that, to me, there's the evidence that for that story is just not as strong as maybe I was like to, and it doesn't necessarily answer that question. The second is that story about aid, and really relatedly state capacity. The big question that I have there is that those two things are actually related, and particularly the kinds of aid that people get is related to the state capacity of the recipient government. So there's new work that's been coming out in the last couple of years which suggests that weak states, or the states that have low state capacity, recipient governments, low state capacity states, donors tend to bypass their governments, so they don't actually give directly to the Somali government because there's really not much going on there, but whatever goes there is bypassed. And so linking the aid argument, particularly from democratic donors that are going to care about that governance capacity more so, I think, that's going to be linked with the kinds of aid you get. And so the recipient governments actually get the aid that are going to sort of operate under this hypothesis are actually the ones that have strong state capacity. So that's sort of my big comment with respect to the alternative explanations. I think they're linked, particularly in the post-Cold War world, as we see this bypass argument taking shape, or mechanism taking shape. Okay, let me turn to the arguments in this paper real quick. So my first question is about the first two hypotheses. Like, I buy the argument, I get the first two hypotheses, totally makes sense to me. What I think needs to, for me, I would like to see in that part is a little better understanding of contextualizing pro-government militias in the larger security apparatus that the regime has. So I usually think about this in respect to authoritarian regimes, and they have a plethora, not just pro-government militias, plethora of organizational units that they use to accomplish some of the same goals you talk about with respect to pro-government militias. So, for example, so the reason I think this is important is because you specify three different types of threat. You see a coup threat, basically from the military, that's from within the coalition, the support coalition generally. Sort of an external domestic threat, which to me sounds like civil insurgents or something, maybe a protest movement, something of that nature. Organized opposition groups, essentially, and then third, foreign military forces. And I think dictators sometimes have different strategies for doing these things. And I think where your pro-government militias fit in, it actually has to do with fighting within a domestic opponent within the country. And if that takes a force, if they're ousted by a foreign government, that can certainly take the form of a counterinsurgency against the occupying forces. I get that. It's the coup-proofing one that I'm really curious about. That is, why is pro-government militias? Why do I have a pro-government militia for that, when I should just create more special guards, more presidential guards, more things that are actually within the structure of the military, and not sort of have these, when I think of a pro-government militia, something that's not necessarily tied into the government structure. But why not keep the people that have the guns that can depose me? If I'm going to try to choose people to be the most loyal to me, to head up a security organization, I actually want them real close to me. I don't want them out in the hinterland or in the urban slums as a pro-government militia. I actually want them next to me in the presidential guard. So putting the pro-government militias and the specific threats that they are intended to counter in the context of the larger security apparatus and the larger strategies that the dictators use, or the leaders, I guess, use for solving these or combating these threats. Okay, but overall, I generally, like, I buy those first two. Like, that makes sense to me. It's a third hypothesis that I had questions about the logic. And there, it's about creating actually more government militias. And so the question I have is why, if your threat increases, sort of the short-term threat that you face for being deposed, if that increases, why actually do you create more, and why not just strengthen one that's existing? So the reason for creating multiple groups is actually to prevent coordination, so that they can't oust you domestically, right? That's why you create multiple security organizations, whether they're pro-government militias or multiple presidential security guards or multiple intelligence services. The reason for doing that is to prevent the multiplication of services is to, or organizations, is to prevent coordination. However, when you're facing a threat, you actually want to provide those who are most loyal with you with the coordination goods to effectively combat the threat. So the question that I have is, why don't you actually empower one group that's really loyal, that has your son or brother in charge, and why multiple groups when you're faced with the imminent threat? So while I see there's evidence for that in empirical work, like the logic to me, got some bounce back there. Sorry, I don't know if that's me or somebody else, but so anyway, that's the big question I had, and I think it's related to the potentially to the type of, again, the type of threat that you're facing. That's the big question I had, and I think it's related to the potentially to the type of, again, the type of threat.
Yeah, Konstantin, I think you're the source of the echo.
Yeah, sorry about that. I went up my phone on and
if you could turn your speakers off.
If you could turn your speakers off. All right, sorry. Yeah. We've never had a soundtrack. That's kind of cool, actually.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah.
My computer's
Okay, I think we're resolved.
All right.
Sorry about that, Joe.
No worries, no worries.
Most unusual interruption you've had, I'll bet.
I've had worse. So the yeah. So there was a comment in the theoretical section which I don't think you needed to make, which actually because I don't think it's true, but I also think if you make it the other way, it helps your argument. And that is that these groups are not necessarily that effective as fighting forces, but I think actually they can be in a particular context, and that's this counterinsurgency context. And in fact, they may be more effective than the formal military structure, particularly if they have local knowledge. You know, I'm not the Civil War guy, but people who know about civil wars talk about having local knowledge and fighting those insurgencies as being really important. That's where maybe they actually are better than the formal military. And I think you talk about that later on, actually, and that makes sense to me. Okay, the data. So the large issue, and I face this in my own research, I think we all face this when it comes to looking at particular organizations, and I know this is an issue that faces this data set that you're using, and that is the pro-government militia data that we have, at least as far as I can tell from digging into it, comes from these newspaper reports, and we basically get them starting in existence when they do something bad and they appear in the media. However, the formation of these groups and the strategies to do that often precede that. That is, they are sort of latent organizations that we actually don't observe doing anything bad in the world until shit happens. And so that's the, and I don't know how to resolve that problem, but I just want to throw that out there as a part of this larger research agenda that is an issue I think that we all face. Okay. And second, I have to say I didn't really buy the way you've operationalized foreign military intervention or presence, I guess, is the word you described, and that has to do with whether or not you oppose or support. The first data set that you have there, I'm not familiar with, but the Pickering and Kisangani one, right? They code this oppose and support and neutral, I think, for the foreign military operations. And at least historically, loads of those in the kinds of contexts you're talking about are French paratroopers coming in to save the day for the incumbent dictator. Like, they're clearly there to support. They're not there to overthrow somebody, the incumbent. And so it just doesn't, to me, pass the smell test, at least historically during the Cold War period, and maybe that's not relevant in this data set, for where a lot of these are coming from. The French had no intention of overthrowing some of their puppets at that point. Now, granted, the Cold War sponsors could turn on their puppets. The U.S. did that a couple times, but at least those immediate interventions that were relatively quick in a lot of instances, it was clearly just straight up support, and there was no threat to the incumbent, just the opposite. Okay. Last 2 points I want to make on the research design. So I think the way you've operationalized these threats is fine for the most part. And what I'm going to say, I'm not necessarily saying is a good thing. I just think it's something to think about, just because I think two-stage models get real tricky very fast. But I'll say it anyway. So using the predicted risk of the phenomena that you want to model. So you basically make the claim that these pro-government militias are there to put down or address the risk of irregular leadership turnover. Well, why not throw your three your three proxies for this risk into a first stage model and actually predict the risk and use that, and then and incorporate the uncertainty from the first stage into the second stage and get sort of a predicted risk kind of thing. And the idea that I had for doing this is actually you could throw measures of state capacity and even foreign aid into that first stage, and what you'd be able to show, if you believe first two-stage stuff, which of course has its own issues, is the extent to which conditional on other stuff, that state capacity and foreign aid directly influence the pro-government militias in the stories that are there in the alternative explanations, and how they influence pro-government militias through this irregular leadership or getting ousted from power mechanism, the risk of getting ousted. So there's a direct effect and there's a indirect effect of those factors on pro-government militia, and particularly for the
Hi, sorry about that, Joe. It sounds like Cristina has joined us. Welcome. I think your speakers are on. Could you turn your speakers off or mute?
Hi. Sorry, I wasn't hearing you for a second.
We're getting feedback, so if you could mute it should be up at top.
You want me to mute the microphone?
Right.
All right. Let me try.
Okay.
Oh, you mentioned headphones. I don't have headphones.
Okay. Well.
Sorry, I'm very new to this Google to the Hangout thing.
Okay. No worries. There should be up top, if you hover your mouse up top, you should see a little microphone. And if you can click that mute, it should kill the feedback.
Is the option on the far left?
Yeah. It says mute the microphone, which I did.
So that worked. So when you're not actually talking, just go ahead and click that, and then unclick it when you're ready to talk. Does that make sense?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, cool. So let's take it back to Joe.
All right. So I just told you to use a two-stage model, and I'm going to tell you not to use one. So you talk about this selection mechanism with respect to selecting into increasing the number of pro-government militias or the connections to them. And there, when you discuss the exclusion restriction, something that didn't quite make sense to me, and maybe I just didn't understand it correctly, and I think that may be the case, which just means it needs to be explained a little bit more clearly, and maybe an example would be helpful. But you basically say that when the government is overthrown, that pro-government militias dissolve. But and maybe that's the case in the sense that they're no longer pro-government because the government's gone. However, they don't actually dissolve. Like, the whole point of part of your theory is that they actually can help the leader who is overthrown to regain power potentially, or some sort of influence later on. And so that didn't quite, like, on the one hand, you use the word dissolve, which maybe for a technical standpoint and how you define these things with respect to the government, that makes sense, but I didn't quite understand how that worked in the real world. But that also leads to me, like, one of the empirical implications of your theory is, which you could test, is that the more of these things you have, or whether or not you have one, that should actually help you under certain circumstances when you do exit power. And so we do have data on post-exit fate, for example, that you could potentially use to test that kind of an argument. Last point before I jump in, or let other people jump in here and take over, is I think your paper has a lot of implications for peacekeeping operations as well, and that folks that think about how to successfully implement those need to think a lot about the implications of your paper. So thanks, I really enjoyed reading it.
Great, thank you, Joe. That was awesome. I don't know if anybody tried to get a one finger on the agenda, but if you did, I missed it. Okay, so I've got Christian on a 1, got Brian on a 1, and I've got Shweta on a 2. Great. So Shweta, I'm going to ask you to hold your 2. Let's give Konstantin a chance to respond. Then we'll come back to Shweta's 2 and move from there. So Konstantin.
Thank you, Joe. Those comments were great. Just to cherry pick a few points to respond to. So on the aid argument, I believe the aid literature, the one that says aid is linked to program militia formation, says that it's sort of a cat and mouse game. You want the program militia to be less and less involved, basically to less and less resemble a government force and commit those human rights violations. And if the monitoring programs are around, they're sort of tallying it back and trying to figure out what is really a program militia, and is this the government committing human rights violations that are taking place. And on to the points in the argument. So why not choose to keep a program militia close if there is a coup threat? Again, this might tally back to the other argument that I make about civil conflict after the government's overthrown. Even if you're overthrown by a coup, you may want this force around in your sort of home base, whether it's Latakia for Assad or Tikrit for Saddam or something like that. Even if there is a coup and you're overthrown, you want these guys to sort of initiate an insurgency. So it does ultimately, you're right, relate back to insurgencies. I take your point on the 2-stage model for the first sort of prediction model. It does seem like also that it is possible to probably go into further depth in each of these groups. There aren't that many groups, there are only about 300, to figure out which ones were actually formed on the years that are related to the data set, or which ones had existed for a few years before and sort of popped up and committed violence on the first instance, and that's what's being coded in the data. Let's see. So in terms of if groups are if program militias are more effective, if in some instances, I'm not sure if that's entirely true. It may be true in some instances, as in they're trained to be counterinsurgency groups, but really they're more like insurgency groups than counterinsurgency groups. Even in Syria or in Iraq, they were never really used explicitly as a military force to fight against insurgents. They're used as more of a mop-up operations to go in and take care of civilians that may have been revolting, usually in very brutal ways. So it's more like the governments are telling us that they're even reticent to use these guys over a military unit that may be packed with their own supporters, as again in maybe Syria or places like that. In terms of why create more militias, I do agree it would probably prevent coordination between them. Ultimately, there are limited finite sources and where you can get guys to join these militias. It's places like sports clubs, criminal elements. So you may just simply run out of football hooligans and soccer and criminals to form one militia, and they may just form another. They're sort of these bandit groups, so they can't grow too large, and then become effective forces in sort of the cases that I've seen on this stuff in post-Soviet situations or in the Middle East or even in Africa. So ultimately, they're sort of these roving bands, and they can't grow to be too large. So if the threat is great enough, you just simply get another bandit to organize another one of them or something like that and pay them off. And I will take your point on the selection model just to explain the instrument for the other comments. Basically, it's sort of an artifact of data. When there is a break, when there's an overthrow of a leader, the pro-government militias that were pro-government stop being pro-government, essentially. And then the pro-government militias that, or the insurgency group or whatever that took over, may have new pro-government militias that become pro-government militias that weren't before. So you have dissolution, technically, of these groups. In the data, I mean, it's not technically a dissolution. A lot of times they stick around. And then you have a formation, technically, again, the groups have been around, but they become pro-government militias in the data. So I want to kind of, maybe this wasn't clear in the paper, but to differentiate between formation of a group and formation of the linkage. So the concern is the formation of the linkage with the government, not explicitly the formation of the group. The group may have been around for years and years and years, but just not explicitly as a pro-government militia. But thank you for your comments. They were fantastic.
Okay, great. Shweta?
Hi, Konstantin, great paper. Thanks. It adds to my knowledge about something that I'm curious about in the real political world as well. My comment, or rather my curiosity, was sort of related to what Joe talked about in terms of contextualizing the use of pro-government militias in the security apparatus, where I sort of felt that you were sort of comparing why leaders use pro-government militia versus using the military, right? And what I was interested in sort of picking your brain about was, what is the relationship between other paramilitary forces that are sort of arms of the state, right? And you mentioned them: Border Security Guard, National Police Forces, and pro-government militia, because there's sort of that in the substitutability argument that you're making in terms of when leaders should use what in the security apparatus. I'm curious about why they would, like, is there something about paramilitary forces that are arms of the state and that are sort of that are going to be less desirable than using pro-government militia for coup grouping? So my question to you is sort of about the relationship between these more legalized paramilitary forces and pro-government militia, and then that relates to the other point that Joe made, which is, why do we expect pro-government militia to be more loyal to the leader than mercenary, right? Where if you have institutionalized paramilitary forces like the National Police Force or the Border Police, they would potentially be fairly loyal and don't have mercenary motives, while PGMs would have those motives. So why do we expect PGMs to be more useful than these more institutionalized paramilitary forces? And so what's the substitutability argument there on this? That was it.
Konstantin, do you?
Sure. Thank you for that. Just what's the relationship between paramilitary groups and other pro-government militias? It seems it's more of a definitional hiccup in the literature in general. Paramilitary groups generally include pro-government militias when they're defined, and they also include a bunch of stuff that is in the military, like gendarmeries and border patrol and the sort of army reserves on occasion. Basically, I think the distinction is that you're within the military command structure, you're still ultimately integrated into that command structure to some extent. The forces are created, maybe splinter the military within the command structure, but ultimately that can create a lot of backlash, and that's what I talked about a little bit in its other articles on coup grouping. The backlash comes from the military, their operational structure is compromised, and they may actually be more likely to rebel if coup grouping measures are instituted, or more likely to try rebelling because they feel like they're being threatened. If you use pro-government militias, the military structure can be sort of kept intact, while at the same time you have a check against them on the outside of the organization. So I think that, but it is a good point, and I will make it clear.
Cristina, with a 2? Other way around. You just muted yourself.
Oh,
Perfect.
Okay. So now it's better. So I wanted to add to just the previous comment. As I was reading this, it felt that it's very unclear, or at least to me, what's the difference between the PGMs and the paramilitary in general. And if there isn't, which empirically it seems that there is not a clear differentiation, then I guess this paper seems not very distinct from the literature on coup-proofing. What's the difference from the literature on coup-proofing if you cannot exactly distinguish between, empirically speaking, between the PGMs and other parts of the paramilitary? And also piggybacking on the previous comment, it also wasn't clear to me, and it felt underdeveloped, this assumption of loyalty. Why are these groups more loyal to the leader? Why is the leader basically their champion and representative? I didn't get a clear sense of why that was the case.
Konstantin?
Okay, real quick. So I think that criticism of paramilitaries is fair in terms of the rest of the literature. I think there is, when using data on paramilitaries in other cases, a lack of clear definition between whether they're part of military, whether they're not. What this does is sort of it subsets it into where we have program militias in one column and sort of not having program militias in another column. Whereas when we say, usually it's a dummy variable for paramilitaries, it's more you have program militias, or you have a gendarmerie, or you have border patrol, or any of the sort of internal military command structure organizations that aren't necessarily a program militia. They're within the military. So it is a fair point, but the distinction probably does need to be made more clearly in the paper. So the assumption of loyalty, it sort of comes from the idea that the military is ultimately beholden to the idea of the state. They're indoctrinated to be defense mechanisms for the state, and their resources come from state coffers. Whereas the program militia is usually employed directly by the leader or the leader's very close inner circle. So the sort of financial accountability the people that are basically paying them aren't necessarily the institutions of the state, the defense ministry, or things like that. It's these sort of side payments that take place from coalition partners of the leader or the leader, him or herself. That it is a very good point.
So,
I think,
Konstantin, is the basic distinction that you want to make one between state coffers and money that's off the books? And I guess either way, one takeaway for you is to clarify that in the paper. I don't know if you can draw it as finely as I just laid out, but I think you're getting from a couple of different points already that greater clarity on that. That's not, okay, yeah, there's a measurement issue, but conceptually, I think you're being asked as well, particularly once you get to the loyalty part of it, right? So I think that's one place where where greater clarity in the paper, I think, is going to be useful.
I think I just on a little bit and clarify that a little bit more. It might not be as clear as state coffers and off the books, but it's more if the leader is overthrown, would the program militia sort of still be employed by the state? And it's a lot less likely than, say, an aspect of the military being employed by the state. They would still sort of have their jobs.
Okay. I have Christian. Oh no, I got two twos. One from Cristina and one from Joe. So Cristina.
Yeah. So just to follow up on that, it felt that you really kind of need to discuss a little bit more this loyalty concept, especially as you transition into those hypotheses about how ethnic militias or religious militias are potentially more loyal, so in that sense, I guess that also goes back to this idea of, are these linkages or is this formation? Because I guess if you are the leader and you have use for these militias, you would want to form the loyal ones. And if they're, and I guess to some extent that begs the question of, I mean, okay, maybe I'm getting ahead of myself here, but it feels that you need to talk a little bit more about loyalty, especially as you transition into this discussion of ethnic and religious groups. Yeah, that's the end of my comment.
Okay, and let's go ahead and take Joe, and then give Konstantin a chance.
Yeah, just real quick, what happens after the overthrow of the government or of the incumbent leader? You know, in a case like Iraq, not only was the pro-government militia not pro-government anymore, but the special security forces were also all disbanded. In fact, the entire military was disbanded. And so even if the foreign force that topples the regime does not totally disband all of the military, they almost always disband the special security forces that were perpetrating some of these human rights abuses. And so, you know, for example, what would happen if the Syrian army was defeated and Assad left? You know, his militias, pro-government militias, would probably still exist afterwards, but there are probably certain divisions within the military that would either be disbanded, but that probably would not be with any new Syrian military. And so there are, you know, when there's and this has to do with, again, that mechanism for which threat are you sort of are you deploying these against? Is it really foreign or is it other ones? And with that foreign, your argument I think holds in a lot of cases. But when it's the foreign wipes out the military, then the same applies to the formal structure of the organizations within the formal structure of the military.
And I apologize. There's also a two-finger from Michigan, so let's go ahead and get that one on the table as well, and then have Konstantin respond.
Hi. So first, I really like the paper. I do a lot with militias and the PGM database, so it was great seeing it sort of in this capacity. I had one suggestion for kind of helping with conceptual clarity, and given that sort of there's all these measurement issues with looking at non-state armed forces that are working with the state, right? Like that's kind of what you're interested in, is these non-formal forces internal to the state that are still being contracted by the state. I think instead of, you know, trying to make sort of a distinction between paramilitaries, militias, you know, local civil guards, it seems like what you're really interested in is policy alternatives for state leaders from using their sort of their formal forces for some sort of internal security. And so I think first framing pro-government militias as one policy alternative versus the policy alternative could really help, right? Because some states don't necessarily have these bands of armed groups running around. That's just not something that exists, but maybe they do have private military contractors that they can rely on. So you're looking at sort of one policy alternative to using formal state forces, and I think sort of broadening that and loosening it and saying, you know, we have data on things called pro-government militias can help you out. So because I do think it's, you know, it's an important finding that when governments are threatened, potentially, or when leaders are threatened, potentially those that have militias present might be using them for their benefit after the threat of a coup. So I think that still gets at policy alternatives that leaders might turn to. So that's just my suggestion. Thanks. And then I think we have another two as well.
Let me just jump in real quick. And Konstantin, that was Meredith Blank and I think Eula Kruger, who's also there, just so you have a sense who you're talking to, or has a comment as well. Eula?
Yeah, hi Konstantin, I'm Yule, and I had a two-finger on what Cristina said because I also had trouble understanding what you actually mean with pro-government militias, and I think in your paper it would really help the reader if you, when you actually, because you make a comment somewhere where you say there is a difference to paramilitaries, but to me it remained unclear what the actual difference is. And I think if you gave like examples for both, like some cases, I know you later talk about case studies, but if you could give some examples up front, what is one and what is the other, it would help us to better understand. And your conceptualization also links them to the empirics, because I was wondering, when I look at your models, what is actually the population you're looking at? Like, what's the time frame, the period of observation that we're talking about here, and what explains the N in your models? So if you could clarify that in your paper as well, that would help.
Great, Konstantin. Let's give you a chance to respond if you'd like.
Okay, sure. Just on Yule's point first and everybody else's point in order. So what's the population of the data set? It's pretty much the program militia data set's full scope, as in all the countries included in it, in addition to countries that don't have program militias, pretty much all the world's countries from 1981 to 2007. But I do agree that this is something in future drafts that I'll help you to make a lot more clear in terms of program militias versus paramilitaries versus, sorry, I said other potential sources. I do think this data set does include private contractors when they're included. When they're fighting executive outcomes in Sierra Leone, I think is in there, and other things like that. But they may not be universally included, so that might be something I need to look at, what to take out, what to keep in there. Joe's comment in terms of would pro-leader groups within the Army be dissolved? Certainly they would be in some cases, but I think on the mean of it, situations like Iraq and Afghanistan are rarer in terms of even overthrow than we think. In a lot of cases, a foreign overthrow could be something along the lines of, as we said, the French interventions or the sort of soft touch interventions that the U.S. had in Latin America, where most of the military stays intact and it's a leader that's removed, then it might be a very similar ruling coalition. But I will take a look at that in terms of a sort of a secondary variable to use later. Thank you for those comments.
Okay, I missed Christian on a 2. Shweta's then got a 2, and then Christian's on a 1. And Cristina, you are currently unmuted, so if you want to mute since you're not, that'd be great. So Christian on a 2.
I should do the 2? Okay, so relevant to the 2 that you'll see is connected to the other one. I think your loyalty point is huge, but the way you set it up is like invoking Weber but not using Weber, which is killing me. So I think the framing of the piece is much larger than you give it credit for, because you're paying too much attention to the more myopic focus of this militia literature. But you have this kind of like, you kind of make this claim that like ethnic identities are more loyal to the leader or more loyal to an individual, and what's lacking of the armed forces. And it's kind of like this charismatic authority versus professionalism. And so effectively you're kind of like in this interesting context where you're
Chris, you broke up on us there. Could you, it just, yeah, your Wi-Fi connection or whatever got a little weird. So could you just try back up like a minute and try again? Sorry about that.
It's like, which part did you get? So that ethnicities, you seem to presume that ethnicities are a stronger connection than some other kind of metric of professionalism, which is Weber, right? And so I sense that that was a big opportunity, because you kind of suggested that there was this kind of ethnic affinity and identity connection, and that it was extremely strong, and actually it didn't matter if you were in power or out of power. These people, you had your people with you. It's good to have some thugs, right? And so there was that. But then we know that ethnicity is not as clearly associated as you might allow. So maybe have an interaction of ethnic fractionalization or some that ethnic group is or something like that to kind of get at that. But there was just kind of, I thought, a bold presumption that ethnic affinity, if you're to base any affinity at all, ethnicity would be stronger than relying upon like soldiers, for example. And
Okay.
the one will contextualize that statement.
We'll take the one in a sec. Can we get Shweta to weigh in on her too, and then we'll move back to Christian after Konstantin's had a chance.
This is to tack on to Meredith's point about how you can, Konstantin, sort of tease out these different sort of policies that a leader can use, or different sort of security apparatus that the leader can use, where maybe we're just arguing over things that are clear in your head but aren't clear in the paper, right? And so if you can sort of just make clear in the paper whether you think, at least for me, it'll be clearer that whether you think paramilitary forces that are institutionalized arms of the state, do you consider them to behave similar to the military, or do you consider them to behave similar to the pro-government militia? Because that, for me, is sort of the confusing point about, again, when should the leader use what? And it seems from the conversation that we are having right now, or some of your reactions to the questions, that you consider paramilitary forces that are institutionalized arms of the state to behave similar to the military, and to behave differently from civilian defense groups like pro-government militia. And if that's not the case, then you need to sort of flesh that out in paper. So that was, I felt that maybe, I don't know if it's helpful or not, I felt that maybe it might be.
Great. Konstantin, let's give you a chance if you'd like it.
Sure. On Christian's point, I definitely agree that it's a strong assumption to say that ethnic groups, religious groups are sort of or the leaders of ethnic or religious groups are sort of stronger ties to his security, will help his security out more than necessarily the actual military that's professional. But I think it is a consistent, in addition to the way it is a consistent sort of assumption that's made in a lot of other works on ethnic conflict, on religious conflict, that even if a government's in charge, it's usually favoring, in some divided societies, it's usually favoring one or several ethnic groups, and if that leader is from that particular ethnic group, that group is very dependent on the leader for patronage, for just basically having a positive status within the government. And if that government status is taken away, if that patronage mechanism is taken away, or even if that group is responsible for a lot of negative things happening in the country, there's a potential of a lot of backlash. So if the leader loses power, it may be the group that suffers more, the ethnic or religious group that's connected to that leader, that the leader himself or herself has used to preserve their regime for a long period of time. On Shweta's comment, I definitely think that that's something that needs to be made clear. It is a fundamental assumption in the paper, sort of, that PGMs are substantively different than the general definition of paramilitaries, or these within military paramilitaries. But ultimately, I think the distinction does stem from the idea that if the army was fragmented in some way, that it would create a lot of backlash within the military, that the pro-government militias sort of remedy that because they don't necessarily openly tell the army that, okay, now there's money is going to this coffer and this coffer and this coffer, and there's all these commanders, and there's all this fragmentation within the armed forces. It may be going to a different coffer that directly aside from the military budget, and it's not impacting them, and it may not affect loyalty as negatively as other factors would. But again, that is an assumption we can discuss, and it may not be something that you guys find plausible. So thank you for that.
Okay, the queue is Christian on a 1. I've got Brian, who's been very patient, on a 1. Cristina on a 1, and I've got myself on a 1. So, Christian.
Okay, so I like the piece. Let me start with that before I go, because the framing was killing me. So, and I'll say it in part this way. So I would retitle your piece "The Promise and Pitfalls of Demonopolizing State Coercion," and I would do this because your actual issue is huge. It's like it is the complete opposite of how we think states are supposed to function and how they're defined. Thus, the minute I started to figure out what you were doing, I'm like, why is Vapor not here? And then the list continued. Why is Huntington not here? Why is Janowitz not here? Palmurder not here? Why is BDM not here? The first, not the second. And I'm just kind of going, that the question you're asking is, why would the state create an alternative or a rival coercive unit? That just goes against all this other stuff, and so that was like a really important framing opportunity. I thought that I felt betrayed by the piece. I felt betrayed, and so related to that, I take these things very personal, as you can tell. Related to that, I then started to ask this other question: was like, are militias an indication of breakdown, or are they a symptom of breakdown? And that I didn't have an answer for, but I felt that the first framing is. It adds on to what it is that you have. It contextualizes it in a way. It draws out some of the huge implications. But this other thing of thinking about what a militia is, I thought was completely kind of theorized or not dealt with. Because I was just like, well, wow, if you're doing this, is that an indication that the state's kind of sucks or that the leader's hedging their bets? I mean, or is it an indication that, you know, this is what you have to do given this context? And I couldn't get my head around that one, but I did come away with this bizarre, like in line with kind of Joe, I came up with this bizarre implication, which is like, it's good to have some thugs. And so I was like, I didn't know that I necessarily wanted to come out with that implication, but I was like, that's clearly the one that I ended with.
All right, so we've learned that, Konstantin, your paper was disloyal to Christian, so, you know, we've got all sorts of loyalty issues going on in today's discussion, so we'll give you a chance to respond.
Thank you for those comments, Christian. The framing, it definitely was sort of a small scale, sort of modified the literature framing. It could definitely be expanded, but I feel like it could also anger people to say, oh, this is the giant thing. At the same time, I do take your point that is this a symptom of breakdown, or is it sort of just a precipitation breakdown? It's not really clear to me, honestly, whether it is, because these program militias tempt us. They tell us, oh, they occur in these failing states like Somalia right before that regime fell in 1990 on program militias, or in other situations in Afghanistan, in all these supposedly failing states. But then they also occur in Ukraine, and you have them in pre-end of the Cold War Europe, technically, in Gladio, things like that. So at the same time, there might be a symptom of state breakdown, or they might be just so universal that in cases where they are in failing states, we think, okay, this is clearly a symptom of state breakdown, but at the same time, they occur in very, what we would think of as strong states. Even in Syria, this should be how we're around before Syria sort of descended into civil war. But yeah, to the extent that is it a good thing to have some thugs around? It's certainly an implication of it, but there are a lot of problems with having these guys around. They're not good at they're good at their jobs of being thugs, but that may not sit well with even your own supporters.
This is
Chris,
why I thought
you look like you're itching to jump in. Is that you're following up?
The quick follow-up too. I mean, this is why I think the piece was so large in the framing that you stepped away from. If this is a phenomena, if Weber is wrong and you don't get away from identity and professionalization doesn't kick in and it's all about your affinity and connections with the agents of coercion, then that says something. That says a great deal, and that is kind of like underlying your piece. But Weber distracted us, right? He made us think about professionalism and training, and it's no longer about that loaded kind of simplistic understanding of ethnic affinity and so forth, and these other things that keep people in line. You challenged that in many ways, and I was suggesting that these identities are central, and we perhaps underplayed the significance of them. And look, it matters not only when you're in power, but when you're out of power as well. That was it.
I mean, I definitely take that point. That is fair, and it is something I need to think about in terms of framing the paper. I do think that the argument that Weber presented was a little bit on the side of this is something that happens in Western Europe. It may not happen as frequently in other places where ethnicity was, one, not as homogenous in countries, and two, was certainly more relevant in terms of governing.
Okay, Brian on a 1, and we've got Cristina on a 1, and then myself.
Okay, thanks. Good morning, all. Konstantin, I really enjoyed the paper. Interesting stuff. Important topic. Couple comments. If I get carried away, feel free to cut me off. First, I thought the paper, as others have alluded to at times, is a little slippery between two dependent variables, PGM formation and linkage. And this particularly came up, for example, in the lit review on how state capacity, state weakness matters. My understanding of how you described the literature was that state capacity is linked to PGM formation, not to the linkages. And does this matter? I think it could matter, because if reviewers start to think about, is this a two-stage process? Do we want a two-stage model, right? And then we've already discussed or heard about some of the other two-stage models that are possible, but do we need a two-stage model here? I'm not sure that we do, but I think at the very least, the paper could maybe be a little more clear or careful about the difference between PGM formation and linkages, and also maybe some descriptive statistics. Are there many cases of countries that have PGMs that are not linked to the government? I don't know, especially since we see in the cases that there are many examples of state-down PGM creation by the state. So they're born linked to the state. Are there cases where that's not happening? Second issue on, is the paper about leadership removal more generally or coup-proofing? I think it's about leadership removal more generally, domestic or foreign, and that's interesting, but in the middle of the paper, there's a section that has coup-proofing in the title, and it seems to be heavily sort of about coup-proofing. That's the threat that leaders are worried about domestically, the coup. And so I started thinking about the Latin American cases, which I know a little bit about. And in those cases in the past few decades, when PGMs have been linked to the government, it hasn't been because of coups or coup vulnerability. It's because in Colombia, Peru, Guatemala, there were civil wars going on. So they needed, or they wanted to rely on, they wanted to delegate force to these civil defense groups in rural areas to fight against the insurgents. This is very different from coup-proofing. They're not against the elites. These are in rural areas. So it's difficult to sort out empirically, perhaps, coup-proofing versus defending against insurgents. But perhaps if you change the language of the paper and make it a little more general about leadership removal, as the title is, and maybe de-emphasize coup-proofing in the middle, or perhaps empirically try to sort out, is it something in civil wars or something of coup-proofing, which are different. Maybe you could empirically sort that out there. In the models, you found that civil wars, there's this huge link between civil war in the country and the PGM linkage. Perhaps that's what's going on, but I'm not sure if that's too much for this paper. Maybe that's the second paper. What's the domestic threat they're worried about? But I think that's something at least to think about a little more. A smaller point, the alternative explanation of international donors. I realize there are a couple papers that make this link between international donors and the PGM linkages, but maybe a more interesting way to describe this would be to talk about, because really the international donor story, donors are part of the mechanism, but it's really about shifting risk. It's about plausible deniability, which I think is quite interesting, and maybe gets at some of Christian's points about the state delegating force. And now this is interesting, but Paul Staniland talks about this, so I think maybe it might be better to set up that alternative story instead of international donors, which maybe is not that exciting to some readers. talking about deniability, whether to donors or to other audiences. And then two quick empirical notes. I didn't see in the quantitative models a measure for Staniland's rebel defection story. Is there a control for that in the models? If not, maybe with the PRIO, dyad, or group level data, you could include something about when there are rebel groups fighting each other in the country. And then finally, I hate to bring up and end with perhaps might be a trivial point, but it seems like there's a lot of multicollinearity in the models, multiple measures of coup risk in the same model, military personnel per capita, military spending per capita. And so maybe your results hold without all these things. But I would think perhaps about taking out some of the controls that you don't need or that aren't the most theoretically justified, because it's unclear if they could be causing problems. But overall, it's an interesting paper. I enjoyed it.
Thanks, Brian. Konstantin, I'm going to jump in. Just, my one is one of the issues that that Brian raised, and it goes back to this international donor pressure. I want to, broaden that. Some of my work coming from interest in the international human rights regime, but I had plausible deniability written down here, right? So I'm on the same issue. If we go outside of your sample, I'm thinking about why, I'm thinking that the Ku Klux Klan fits your description of a pro-government militia, right, throughout the Jim Crow South, and these are examples. The examples from Latin America that Brian pointed out, these are examples where states have an incentive to delegate to, they need work, they want to commit human rights violations, and they, part of it is they want to display to the community they wish to control the fact that they can do this. It's a power move. We can, we can behave with impunity, but they also want that deniability, right? And in fact, being able to engage in impunity despite being monitored is part of the power play. It's part of what you're doing. And so that's the type of pro-government militia, or what is often called a death squad, that I'm familiar with, and so I know you have the control for the donors, but I really suspect that many of your pro-government militias can be categorized across two types. That there's probably heterogeneity in this process that's non-trivial, and so I would encourage you to give that some more thought. I mean, it's good that you control for the aid, but for me, that's not enough to tell me that your story is capturing. And because, and I confess, because as a reader, I'm biased. I'm very familiar with a certain type, not very familiar with the coup-proofing type. Other readers are going to be different. And when you're stuck with a reader like me, I think you're going to want to try to address that issue fairly head-on, more head-on than I've got a control variable.
Shall I respond? So let's just take Will and Brian's points together. It's definitely a point taken that international donor pressure seems like it is driving some of these to the extent that it's a mechanism for states that do have insurgencies to realistically use violence with impunity against some people who oppose them. At the same time, where I sort of find that argument is plausible. It very well could have that effect. It's not very generalizable. And in terms of a general theory, I think the donor argument could play into my sort of larger argument that a state is facing external threats, it uses pro-government militias. It may give them deniability, but it also may ultimately give them an opportunity to, if those threats overpower them, to use these very same militias to give them an opportunity to stay in power in the future. Those civil defense militias could very well have been a Contra-like insurgency if the Colombian government had been overthrown. It never came very close to it, but in 1996 there was sort of an inevitability feeling of maybe the government's going to get overthrown in the next couple of years. And this could be the backbone of a Contra-like insurgency. And obviously the Contras are also the backbone of a Contra-like insurgency in similar cases. So to the extent that it may very well play into deniability, it could also at the same time play into just survivability. But I'm not entirely sure how to differentiate that in general, because it may simply not be something that we can quantitatively define. And just on Brian's other points, is again in these Latin American cases, I think we are fighting insurgents, and it's not necessarily a coup-proofing story exclusively. So it can be a fighting foreign opponents to the regime story. And when we do that, again, program militias have these sort of intrinsic benefits in terms of both survivability and if the army chooses to start defecting toward the rebels or things like that, you have theoretically a more loyal force to the regime. But thank you for both of those comments, and I will try my best to explain them better in the paper.
Okay, so the queue is Cristina with a 1 and Christian with a 1. So Cristina?
Yeah, hi. So I guess by now my point has become a 2. So I mean, basically, it's as I was reading the paper, this point then goes back to Brian's point about what are these threats of leader removal. So to me, that sort of theoretical development was done page 10, 11, leading up to H1. And I mean, quite honestly, it felt very skimpy in some sense. I mean, it was not clear whether foreign actors or domestic actors outside the ruling, how do they act? What are their incentives? And in what sense are they different from coups? I mean, foreign actors can operate through coups very easily. We know that. Maybe they can go via invasion. That's another possibility. But it's just not. The discussion is not clear, and then the discussion of domestic actors outside the ruling coalition. Well, that may be through civil war, but then the footnote sort of doubts that civil war is a direct existential threat. So in that sense, I guess I was also missing a discussion or a reference perhaps to Milan Svalik's work. Yeah, I guess that's what I had to say on this point. And just to throw in something about the empirics, I was reading the hurdle model with a large degree of curiosity because I didn't know much about it. But as I was looking at the estimates, I'm just wondering whether they kind of screw up the findings. At least in the first part, the logistic regression on incidents. I'm just curious whether it's useful for you really to explain the numbers, and if you do that, does that deny some of your earlier findings, and how is that squaring? Thank you.
Okay, Konstantin?
Thank you for that. So let me just first touch on the hurdle model. So that's not actually, it is confusing, and I'm probably going to take that first stage out, but that's not actually the first hypothesis being tested. The test is whether you have a program militia in a year formed or not formed, or just, it's basically a dummy of whether you have one or not. So it's not actually testing anything beforehand. It's sort of an empirical tool to get at the second stage of, like, these two processes are different, whether you have one and how many you have. But it may be more clear and may make for a less unwieldy table to just put that one out into an appendix or something and have the full table in there. In terms of sort of leader removal, so the framing idea here wasn't so much that these are what the incentives of the foreign governments were. It's what kind of message is being sent to the leader that would make him form a pro-government, make him or her form a pro-government militia. So if there's a coup attempt, very likely that leader now thinks that there could be another coup attempt. If there's a foreign military presence in the country, even if that presence is nice to the leader on day 1, it may not necessarily be nice to the leader on day 14. It could be used as a baseline for coups. It could, a no-fly zone, for example, be used to shield regime opponents, and it very well gives that leader a message that he or she may soon be overthrown. And similarly, if there are external challengers, even if these challengers are in exile in France or Britain, if they have sort of a legitimate claim to the throne, that leader overthrew them, or they're constitutionally empowered, and they're sort of agitating, even if they're not necessarily leading an insurgency against the leader. That could be a component of it, but it's not. These sort of threats send the leader a message that I could be overthrown, and I may need to hedge my bets against something like that happening. And it's not necessarily a very real threat that needs to be there. A real threat very certainly helps, and actually having a civil war is a significant predictor for this stuff. Bar none, but you don't need to necessarily have that happen. But again, thank you.
Christian, I have you on a 2 and a 1, so floor is yours.
Okay, so the 2 was kind of like, Konstantin, the more I hear you talk, right? I'm like invoking old dead people, right? I'm like thinking Richardson now. I'm thinking arms models, because effectively it's like, I'm like, the minute you start to mobilize a militia, others are going to respond, right? And so the model for me gets very interesting, because like, why would you mobilize either a nascent group, a group that's kind of sitting around and waiting, and then you have some institutions that are like already there, right? So you're the leader, you have the police and the military, you have some armed groups that you could basically kind of move on your side already, they're already together, and then you have some nascent community that you could basically start to mobilize. That gets to be a very kind of interesting kind of like argument, right? But the minute you start to mobilize one, the others are going to be like, yo, what's Fred doing? I say, yo, we need to stop this right now. And then you have this domestic arms race model thing, which is deviating from the poorly theorized, I'll just say it, the poorly theorized, and I don't really like it, militia literature in terms of like capturing some of the dynamics that we're just outlaying right now. But that was my 2. My 1 was, what's up with the news source bias thing? Now, I raised it in the following way. It's like, so what militia declarations or agreements are likely to be known and then newsworthy? This is completely ignored. I understand exactly why you wish to do it. That is the wise move to do. but that said, if you start thinking about, because I kept wondering, I'm like, well, how would a news agency know that we're about to form some organization or that we've dissolved something? And that's not talked about, right? So I'm like, you could have news coverage of the country. You could have the number of news organizations in the country. You could have NGO presence. I'm thinking of people who would have this type of information. And I'm like, I don't know why we don't have these as standard controls. The minute you have a news source, I'm looking for those variables in it. But I also want like a horror thing in the world variable, because it's a news hole. It's a news hole effect, right? So if there's when Rwanda was going on and when the South African election was going on, there was no other news. I mean, so it's like we shouldn't be surprised that our likelihood decreases. So I think there should be a battery of standard kind of news coverage variables the minute we're using a news variable, and then I'd be more apt to believe it. Or at least a standard section is kind of like, okay, these are the standard criticisms you get. So if you like reading a social movements piece by like Sarah Soule or McCarthy or those people, there's a standard kind of news media source bias problem or standard things that you do, and we're controlling for that. So I was kind of missing those.
So I don't know if Christian was just making an appeal for co-PIs on a data collection project proposal, but no, apparently he wasn't. Okay. But he does want those data. I'd like them too. That'd be awesome. I saw Eula did a 2-finger, so let's go to Michigan.
And Meredith was before me. You just didn't see it, so I'll give her the.
We're going to do the Michigan double team again. So I have sort of really two twos going off of both of Christian's point. One, Konstantin, I'll send you. There's a book that basically discusses. I can't remember his name right now. He's a sociologist who looked at the sort of co-constitutive nature between the state and security organizations. And the argument there is that they are constantly co-developing, and of course this is very hard, much like Tilly, it's very hard to test that theory in whole, but I think your empirics maybe get at a piece of that, and it's a way to also tie back into this larger story that Christian is talking about, like that this is not just about how a leader may use armed thugs to protect himself against the military, but it's about sort of a broader story of how these state or non-state institutions co-evolve with each other. And I'll send you the stuff after this, because I do really think it ties in well with that story. The second thing is, I know for my own work I've had to look into using Freedom House measures, because part of this thing that also Will gets into is it might not just be donor aid, it's a broader sort of external story about the external environment looking in at what you're doing as a state leader. And so it's not even necessarily being tied to donor aid. It might be like, is there a lot of external news presence? And thankfully, luckily due to like Freedom House, those are measures that you can incorporate for the time frame. And it's a rough estimate, but it can, help say, first sort of looking at uneven reporting that we know is occurring in these cross-national data sets because of, uneven reporting across news sources. And also, more substantively, is there something about states that are more exposed, right, to the international community that changes sort of their decision calculus? So that can be like a first rough measure for what Christian wants to do.
Yeah, and I had a question because as I was reading your data section, when you talked about that they are coded as PGMs when they are identified as pro-government or sponsored by the government, and I just had a general question, is it, because I'm curious, I don't know much about it, how much is it in the interest of the government to actually make known that they have PGMs, and like how much is it in their interest to make known that they are sponsoring these groups, because that would kind of also openly admit that they are diverting public money to actors that are actually not really state actors and institutionalized. So how much are they actually like institutionalized as a group to show that they're there and that they're being used?
And just really quickly going off that point, I think it also ties into something Will brought up, is that there are different types, right, of these pro-government militias. There's, for example, what I think was done in Liberia, where it was made very clear that there were these contracts with militias, and like you can go in and read about how the state made these very public contracts with these groups. And then there's these death squads that we're probably not going to have access to these happened unless something weird happens. So that's just some other things to think about.
Okay, Konstantin?
So yeah, basically all the points are about news sources, so I'll just sort of broadly address that. We definitely can have better measures of how well the media penetration into a country is. Something I was thinking about doing just as you guys were talking was throwing in the Freedom House or the Van Bell media freedom measures into one or several of the models, especially the POSAM model, which it really worked with. It's the zero inflated model of does it decrease the number of zeros that you have if you have a certain media environment versus others. For the most part, that's something that's very doable, although a deeper analysis of it, again, is problematic. I think the distinction between sort of whether it's public or very discreet also varies by the regime. In some cases, you want to make it public because you're sort of advertising that, hey, people who want to overthrow me in a coup, you guys need to realize that I have this militia, and maybe even soldiers who are loyal to me, you should join this militia, or you should join this sort of pro-government group, sort of Jerry Rawlings effect of he forms these national self-defense councils, so soldiers that are loyal to him join up with the group sort of in their part-time and are members in order to control against groups. But at the same time, there's a lot of other cases where these groups are very discreet, but for the most part, their discretion is undermined by their composition, and in many cases, they have flamboyant leaders, they have people who want to be known, and guys like Arkan in Croatia, the guys that led Hedroni in Georgia, they sort of were very full of themselves and like to advertise, give media interviews, help people try to get a lot of world attention for themselves. So it definitely varies, but the extent is that trying to keep these groups secret is ultimately very difficult in terms of based on the violence they commit and the leadership that tends to either occupy the actual groups or the groups themselves. But thank you for those points, and I will again clearly restructure the paper to make these things clearer.
Okay, great. We've got a little less than 10 minutes. I know Cristina has a meeting, and she's going to have to jump off a little bit early. So the queue happens to be open. Cristina, since you have to jump, did you have anything left that you didn't get a chance to raise?
Okay, I'm not sure. I'm looking at my list. I guess maybe in terms of modeling coup risk or leader removal risk more formally, I'm just wondering whether that's not possible to do. So at this point, I guess you have 3 indicators of leader removal. Is there a way to have to have a predictive model first that would give you something of a continuous measure of risk removal, and would that help? I mean, maybe it would. And it would solve to some extent some of the concerns that Brian had, which is there's some overlap into how far removed are you from a coup versus whether you came through irregular means. I mean, they're likely to sort of overlap to some extent. So maybe that sort of a approach would help you with some of these issues.
Okay, great. At some point you just have to leave, so let me go ahead and thank you now, Cristina. I'll thank the group later. Konstantin, give you. Oh no, let's get Joe on. Joe's got a 2-finger. Let's get Joe on this.
Just real quick on the model specification. In modeling leaders' survival, there are a couple of things in the models that raised a little red flag for me. In particular, the variable recent regime overthrow. I'm not sure. I think that might be the polity durable variable, and that's going to capture a lot of different kinds of events. And in particular, some of the events it's going to capture are things like recent coup attempts, particularly those that are successful, and leader irregular entry. And it's also going to overlap with the polity score, because of course it's derived from the polity score, if that's in fact what regime duration or recent regime overthrow comes from. So this gets back to Brian's point about collinearity there. These are a lot of things are highly significant here. If recent coup attempt is really picking up recent coups, that's really in recent regime overthrows, and if you got both of those in the same model on the right hand side, they're bouncing off each other in funny ways that I don't know what's what. So I think you need to think carefully about what each of those things are, and I would actually advise against using polity at all, because even though you've got out the interstate conflict, I guess, intrastate conflict with the using the X score, there's still loads of other domestic things that are going on there, like coup attempts and regime overthrows that are being captured in that variable as well. So you're throwing them all together in the same model. I don't know how they're bouncing off of each other and what that means.
Okay, thanks. Konstantin, let's give you a chance to not only respond to those two, but also, once you've done that, to go ahead and, you've got a group of people here who read your paper. Do you have any questions that you'd like to bounce off of us? It's a great opportunity, so why don't you take advantage of that?
Thank you, guys. So just real quick to clarify that point on the recent overthrow variable, I don't think it correlates as strongly as it may appear. So the recent overthrow variable is the Archegos data of when a leader is irregularly removed. The irregular removal variable is, has the leader gained power through regular force, not necessarily in that year, but at any point. The coup attempt variable is only coup attempts, so it's not actually overthrows of the leader. It is obviously likely that coup attempts or recent coup attempts correlate with leaders being overthrown, because if you have an attempt, you're going to get overthrown.
So it's failed coup attempts.
Yes, it's failed coup attempts.
Okay.
It's not real.
My misunderstanding. Okay.
But yeah, for the most part, I think that's is a fair point that polity still is going to be correlated with some of the stuff, and I'll run it through and see if the correlation is too high, and then dump out more variables, because right now it's only the overthrow variable that I remove when I use polity. But if it's necessary to dump them out, I'll be happy to do that. As far as questions for you guys, one thing I'm sort of grappling with is, to what extent do sort of hypotheses 3 and 4 even belong in this paper, or should they be tossed out altogether? And given the number of suggestions you guys are making, I'm not sure if it might be better for, just in terms of scaling, to just focus on the first 2 questions and ignore 3 and 4, or leave 3 and 4 for another paper. So love to hear what you guys have to say in terms of.
Yeah, Joe, it seems to me that your comments were more directly on that than any others. So let me ask you first if you have any, and ask everybody else to just give a finger if you'd like to weigh in on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a really nice story for the first 2 hypotheses, and I had real questions about the third one, and then once you get into third and fourth one, you start running into issues where you're doing some 2-stage modeling, which those kinds of things are always dicey, and really nailing down the first 2 hypotheses, even just showing some unconditional means. That is some descriptive data that show your some patterns that are consistent with the hypotheses, I think would be really nice additions at the front end, particularly as you're describing the data. And so that you don't have to worry about the dicey issues with the selection, and I can't remember if it was 3 or 4. And also, one of my initial comments was I didn't particularly understand or buy the logic for number 3. I mean, even if your response to hypothesis 3, when I said, well, why don't you just empower an existing one? Why create a new or more militias? Again, it has to do with how these things are coded, and whether or not they are, like, even if you've got 2 soccer organizations, or you need to go down the street to the, I don't know, to the bar to get more, why not just form them into one group to give them the coordination goods? If they're supposed to be effective in preventing a threat, and why not just empower the one? Proliferation seems to me designed to not provide coordination goods, and to make sure that they're designed to make sure that that security agent doesn't actually hurt you, but and designed not necessarily to be effective as a security threat. And that's actually the dilemma that Svolok outlines in his work on the coups, and in his book that I think was being referenced earlier, is you've got that dilemma between providing the coordination goods, because they can be used by the agent to oust you, but on the other hand, you need that agent to do some bad stuff sometimes.
Okay, great. And Brian?
Right. I would just concur with Joe that I think hypothesis 3 in particular, I think maybe introduces more problems, raises more questions than perhaps one might want to need to answer. So if you're going to cut one, as far as I'm concerned, 3 is interesting. I mean, it could be a whole separate paper, but that's also a sort of a challenge as well. But just that brief comment.
All right, great. Well, that basically has us at time, so I'd like to take a moment to thank all of you, particularly those of you who took the time out to read and join us for the discussion. Obviously, without you folks, we don't have a workshop, so very much appreciate that. Konstantin, thank you for getting us an interesting paper, and just to remind everybody that Chris and I put this together to try and leverage this technology to create a forum where untenured faculty and PhD students could get feedback on their work. We put out the call in August and in December, August for the fall, and we'll have 6 slots next spring. So please keep an eye out for the call of papers. Make your junior colleagues and PhD students aware of it. Encourage them. We do require an actual draft of a paper. This isn't like when you send your one paragraph abstract. But thanks for helping us keep it involved, and do keep us in mind and look for those calls. All right. Thank you much. Take care, all.
Thank you.